Hi, it's Dr. Ice. I'm here to give you part 3 of the Freud lecture. And this part details Freud's psychosexual stages of personality development. So these are the psychosexual stages of development and how individuals negotiate these stages of development will have a big impact on their personality, according to Freud, because your personality develops as you negotiate your way through each of the stages. Now, you'll notice that the age ranges are a little bit different, and that is the case between different people who interpret Freud's writings. So sometimes you'll see a little bit of difference in the age. So Funder talks about the oral stage as being from birth to 18 months, whereas you can see that the age range is a little bit different here for these stages. The important thing to remember is that Freud thought that conflict was something that happened in each stage. In each of the stages, the desires of the id come into conflict with the constraints of civilized society. So that is the conflict that the child has to negotiate in each stage. And I will detail these, and it might be helpful for you if you download the study guide that has a chart. It has a table that you can fill in the information for each of the psychosexual stages of development, and that is posted on Canvas. Okay, the first stage is the oral stage, and this is from birth to 18 months, birth to 2 years, depending on who's interpreting Freud's work. And you can see that the main physical focus in this case is the mouth and the lips and the tongue. This is really all that babies can do. They have control of their mouths. They have a powerful sucking reflex. They use the mouth to explore new objects that they might pick up off the floor. Unfortunately, for one of my kids, it was a snail or a slug that I barely prevented him from exploring with his mouth. Gross. But this is what kids do. They don't have a lot of dexterity, and so their main physical focus is the mouth. Pleasure is obtained from the mouth, according to Freud, and taking things in. And the main psychological theme in the oral stage is dependency or independence. So what has to happen in that stage is that kids have to be weaned, or that's the conflict. And the weaning has to do with being completely dependent on someone else for their nurturance and sustenance versus being able to take care of themselves. And so this is the conflict that Freud thought that kids have to deal with in this stage. And Freud's idea for each of these stages was to resolve the conflict in a way that is sort of middle of the road, a moderate conflict resolution. So you don't want to be overly dependent when you negotiate this stage, and you don't want to be overly independent either. So the golden conflict resolution is somewhere in the middle where you're somewhat dependent on others, but also somewhat independent from other people. I'll talk about what happens if you are not able to successfully completely resolve conflict in this stage. It results in something called fixation, which again, I will talk about in just a few minutes. One other thing is that when babies are born, they are all id. Now, if you haven't watched the lecture on the internal structure of the mind with the id, the ego, and the superego, you need to do that before you continue to watch this one, otherwise it won't make sense. But the id is all about primitive urges, primitive desires. Those are babies. Babies, when they are hungry, they cry, they scream, and they expect to be fed. The next stage, and this is somewhere between 18 months to 3 years, and again, that changes depending on who's interpreting Freud's work. But the main physical focus in the anal stage is the anus, because the conflict that has to be overcome here is potty training. And really the themes, the psychological theme that goes with the stage is having self-control of your body and your life versus being completely obedient to somebody. And babies come to this realization that they have some control when they realize that they're able to either successfully use the potty and make their parents happy, or not use the potty, and then they can make their parents very unhappy. And they also realize that their parents have some control over them when they demand to have something like candy or something like a cookie, and their parents say no. This is something that happens to kids, and sometimes we call it the terrible twos. When this happens, kids are trying to figure out a way to get what they want. And so this is where the ego develops, that part of the personality, that executive part of the personality that tries to figure out how to negotiate getting what they want. Because they realize that they can't have everything they want when they hear the word no. The next stage is the phallic stage, and this is somewhere between 3 to 5 years, depending on who is writing about it. And the physical focus, obviously, with the word phallic, is the penis. And what happens in the stage is the child discovers that they either have a penis or they don't have a penis. Now, Freud's interpretation of this was that boys get a lot of anxiety because they feel some sort of sexual attraction to their mothers, and they feel like their fathers are going to find out and they're going to castrate them because of that. So that's castration anxiety. And girls, on the other hand, they realize that they don't have a penis, and that generates anxiety too because they feel like somehow they don't measure up. In boys, that attraction to the opposite sex parent is something that Shakespeare also wrote about. He developed a play about it, and so that's where Freud came up with the name, the Oedipal complex. And sexual attraction towards the father from a daughter is called the Electra complex. Freud mentioned that when girls realize they don't have a penis, they experience something called penis envy, because, how can you live without a penis? The key conflict that has to be resolved in this stage is gender identity. So Freud explains it this way. The boys, when they realize they have a penis and they experience sexual attraction towards their mother, they fear that their fathers are going to castrate them because they have those sexual desires. And so they realize that the solution then is to identify with the father and be on the father's side. And that's how they can get rid of that anxiety. Whereas the girls also need to identify with their mothers, and that helps them somehow get over the grief that's created with the penis envy. So the resolution of this psychosexual stage of development is the identification with the same-sex parent. This is the stage where the superego is born, because Freud thought when children feel that anxiety of being sexually attracted to the opposite sex parent, or the fact that they don't have a penis, or if they're boys, that they're worried about their penis being castrated, it generates guilt and anxiety. And so guilt is really what the superego uses to get his way or her way. The next stage, which happens somewhere around 6 years, 7 years old, and it continues until puberty, is the latency stage. And in the latency stage, any psychic energy is directed away from sexual organs and body parts and more into learning how to develop into a person who can function in society. So there's no psychosexual development that's going on. Freud thought that there's really no conflict that needs to be resolved. And all that psychic energy instead is focused on learning the skills that they need to be successful in the world: reading, writing, math, speaking. This all comes to an end when children experience that hormonal surge at puberty and a sexual awakening. And at that point, if kids are able to get through all of the previous stages with enough psychic energy to still be able to function well and not a lot of hang-ups, which he calls fixations, then they have entered the genital stage, and that's puberty through adult life. This seems to be the destination for Freud. This is the end goal. The libido, so psychic energy, is focused on the genitals, and there's really no specific conflict in this stage. But you only reach the stage if you resolve fairly successfully conflicts at previous stages. So all the conflicts from the oral, the anal, and the phallic stages. The focus for this stage is creating life and also contributing to a better society. Okay, what happens? How is personality developed as kids go through these stages? Here's what happens. In each stage, the id has these physical desires, right? And they're focused on a body part. In the oral stage, it's sucking and wanting to experience everything with the mouth. In the anal stage, it's potty training, but really it's all about self-control and wanting to control other people. And in the phallic stage, it's all about identification with the same-sex parent and the development of their sexual identity. In each of those stages, the id clashes with civilized society. For babies, it's whether they get their needs met. In the anal stage, it's that babies can't have everything. And then in the phallic stage, it's that you can't have sexual relations with your opposite sex parent, as weird as that sounds. That's what Freud thought. So this generates conflict for kids, and they have to either successfully resolve that conflict in the stage, or they don't. And if they don't successfully resolve that conflict, what happens is that some of their psychic energy gets deposited or left behind in that stage. They still experience the unresolution of the conflict in that stage. And Funder explains it this way. You have a certain amount of psychic energy, according to Freud, right? We have conservation of psychic energy. As you move through the psychosexual stages of development, when you have a conflict in each stage, if you don't successfully resolve it, you leave a little bit of that psychic energy there to keep dealing with that conflict. And so the end goal, according to Freud, is to get through all of the psychosexual stages while still having enough psychic energy left over, because you haven't had to leave it behind to fight those conflicts. If you can get all the way through, then you have developed a healthy personality. But if you don't, if you leave some psychic energy behind in a certain stage or in multiple stages, you develop something called fixation. Fixation is when conflict experienced in a stage is not completely resolved. Fixation is apparent in personality characteristics. And so here are some examples of fixations that might happen. If you have a fixation in the oral stage, something having to do with pleasure of the mouth is something that you might develop. So you might be a smoker, you might be a compulsive gum chewer, you might bite your nails, you might have compulsive overeating or refuse to eat, according to Freud. Those are some of the oral fixations. On the other hand, or maybe in addition to, you have a fixation in the anal stage. Remember, this stage is all about control and obedience. So if you have conflict in that stage, then you may have an excessive need to maintain order and maintain self-control. Or, on the other hand, if you have a fixation in that stage, you may actually be very sloppy or very messy or not able to control the things that are going on in your life. Examples of a fixation in the phallic stage have to do with our sexuality and our self-image. And so you might be somebody who has an excessive amount of vanity, who is narcissistic, or fixation might result in somebody who is hypersexual or not very modest at all, someone who is prideful. But also the opposite may occur. You may have somebody who is excessively modest or asexual as a result of conflict. So what you notice probably is that the result of a fixation is somehow an exaggeration, an over-exaggeration or an under-exaggeration of the psychological theme and conflict for each stage. Now you notice there's not fixations for the latency stage nor for the genital stage, because remember, there's really no conflict that is associated with either of those stages. Here's some examples of oral stage fixations. I just found these GIFs, so I thought that they would be fun to kind of take a look at. You can see people who smoke, people who vape, and maybe people who are obsessed with brushing their cat's teeth. That might be an example of fixation in the oral stage where they're very focused on oral health. How about some anal stage fixations? Another result of a fixation in the anal stage is that you may really love potty humor. So you may think something like that is funny. Or you may be very sloppy and messy, because remember, it's all about control and obsessiveness versus rebelling, not being obedient. Here's another example of the anal stage. Again, I was saying it's controlling, or maybe the inability to relax and not be in control of everything all the time. These are more examples of fixations in the anal stage.
And now for the phallic fixations.
Hypersexuality. My favorite go-to character is Austin Powers. Or here's an example, Queen Victoria. I don't know if you remember Queen Victoria or if you learned about her, but in the Victorian era, I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, it was all about not talking about sexuality at all. It was all about being very modest and dressing with collars all the way up the neck. You can see that there's really not a lot of Queen Victoria showing here, because no one was supposed to talk about sex and sexuality. You're supposed to be extremely modest. It turns out that Queen Victoria was not modest at all. She was very sexual. She talked about her sexuality. There's just a lot of information that's come out now that her persona of being very proper and modest outwardly is definitely not what she was like with her family. Okay, so how does all this relate to personality development? Well, hopefully I've given you a little bit of information about that so far, but let me just summarize. Personality is developed as we go through those psychosexual stages. And to the extent that we're able to go through all of those stages with successful resolution of conflict, so that we don't have any fixations and we don't leave that much psychic energy behind, we're going to develop a healthy personality. And by that, Freud thought a healthy personality is somebody who has a very strong ego. And I'll talk more about that in the next part, which is about defense mechanisms. So when you resolve a conflict, you successfully have negotiated what you needed to in that stage and you're able to move on. But if you don't, then you are left with a fixation. Fixations are present in personality characteristics. I showed you some of the possible ways that people show that they don't necessarily show them, but it's apparent that they have fixations. People that are excessively orderly or sloppy or hypersexual, for example, or obsessed with pleasure of the mouth, gum chewing, smoking, vaping.
Successful personality development means
getting through all of the stages with enough of that psychic energy or that army that Funder talks about intact. And if you are successful in developing your personality, Freud thought that results in your ability to work and to love. The ability to be productive and maintain loving relationships, that was a sign of a healthy personality, according to Freud.